Welcome back to Askewed Reviews. And of course, we are continuing the Friday the 13th series with the 1985 film Friday the 13th Part 5 A New Beginning. Here is your trivia question for today. What scene in this film was actually a cut scene from the last one, Friday the 13th, the final chapter? The answer will be at the end of this video. We now pick up 5 years later after the last movie, so it is now 1989, and Tommy is a little bit more grown up, and he spends some time in some mental facilities. Also, apparently, there's no explanation as to whatever happened to his older sister. So Tommy ends up at a place called Pinehurst, where it's a youth development center. Now, aside from Tommy, there are quite a few other troubled youths that also reside here. There's also a couple staff members, including a man named George, and his grandson Reggie is also there for some reason. Now, of course, because it's a Friday the 13th movie, Jason is back, and somehow survived everything that happened to him in the last film. And of course, once again, he's off on a path of violence, and absolutely no one in this town is safe. The question becomes, is it actually Jason, or is Tommy the true killer? The director for this film is Danny Steinman, and he was originally going to write and direct a sequel to The Last House on the Left, but since that fell through, the producers at Paramount decided to give him this movie instead. Producer Frank Mancuso Jr. ended up not liking director Danny Steinman, mainly due to the fact that he thought he was a pervert and essentially just trying to make softcore porn instead of a slasher flick. This film was shot in California, and it's also one of the few films in this series that actually takes place on Friday the 13th. The fake working title for this film was Repetition, which is also a song that was done by David Bowie and would continue the tradition of some of the Friday the 13th movies having David Bowie songs as their working title. A good portion of the concept for this film actually came from an idea they had for the third film. The original plan was to actually have Corey Feldman reprise his role as Tommy Jarvis, but he was already starting work on the movie The Goonies, so instead they rewrote the script and then just gave him a cameo in that opening dream sequence. Speaking of that opening sequence, it ended up being a bit of foreshadowing for the grave digging that occurred at the beginning of the next film. Also, the original concept for this dream sequence was very different. Both Tommy and Jason's body were going to be taken to the same hospital, and then suddenly Tommy would have had a fit of psychotic rage, attacking the hospital staff while trying to get to the morgue and find Jason's body. Once he finds the body, Jason would rise up and then he would wake up from the dream. Ted White, who did play Jason in the final chapter, was offered the opportunity to reprise his role, but ended up turning it down due to his bad experience with the last director. He has said years later that he did regret that decision. So even though in the film Jason is actually Roy, Dick Wyand, who plays Roy, only played that character. The rest of the time, Jason is actually played by stuntman Tom Morga. One of the things they did in this movie that was actually clever was they gave some clues here and there that it was not the actual Jason. For instance, he has the blue stripes on his mask, and even in the beginning dream sequence, he has the red on there instead. Roy also, when he sees his dead son, there's a little musical cue, and when the deputy tells the sheriff a maniac is on the loose, the camera cuts to Roy giving them a glance. To get prepared for his role, John Shepard actually worked at a state mental hospital for a short time. Mark Venturini, who plays the character of Victor, originally auditioned for the role of Tommy. Sherilyn Fenn was offered the role of Violet but turned it down to do the movie Just One of the Guys. Deborah Voorhees admits that she more than likely got the role of Tina in the film because her last name was Voorhees. Darcy DeMoss and Gina Gershon were both up for the role of Tina. DeMoss was offered the role, but apparently she was fired because Danny Steinman asked her to take her top off and she refused to do a nude scene, so he got rid of her. Technically, she has actually been in two other Friday the 13th movies. Her video Aerobicize did appear in the fourth movie, and she did end up auditioning for the next one where there was a new director and she was in Jason Lives. Juliet Cummings, who played Robin, was apparently a US Olympic gymnast for 14 years before she got into acting. This was unfortunately the final film role for Vernon Washington. So there is a sequence in the movie where Tommy looks out of a window and sees Jason. Now, in this sequence, John Shepard looks out and there's Tom Morga in the Jason costume. Tom Morga looks through a window and he ends up seeing Dick Warlock's ass. Warlock was a stuntman on the film, and he did this as a prank, as Warlock actually played Michael Myers in the second Halloween film, and this was kind of a joke rivalry thing. In fact, Warlock even showed up to set one day in full costume. The sex scene with Deborah Voorhees was originally 3 minutes long, but the MPAA forced Danny Steinman to cut it down to 10 seconds. It's funny that Jason is not actually the killer in this movie, as this is also the first time they've referred to him as Jason Voorhees and not just Jason. In case you were wondering, it is more than likely that all the candy bars that Joey eats are Mr. Good bars. While making this film, there was actual plans of starting a new trilogy off the back of this one with a whole new villain, but that completely got dropped to the wayside as they realized that the reception for this movie was so bad, so they went back to Jason. So the body count for this film is 19, but if you do include the dream sequences, it's technically 22. These first two don't count because they're from the dream sequence at the beginning. Neil is macheted in the stomach, and Les gets stabbed in the neck. Now, our first official one is not even done by the true killer of the movie, as Joey gets axed to death by Victor. Now, something that really bothered me about this was that Roy sees his dead son's body, and this causes him to go crazy and do his murder spree. But the guy who actually killed his son, Victor, is not one of his victims because he gets hauled off by the police. Anyway, Vinny is the next one with a road flare to the mouth. Then there's Pete, who gets his throat slit by a machete. Then Billy gets an axe to the back of his head. Lana gets an axe to the chest. Raymond then gets stabbed in the stomach. Tina gets her eyes gouged out with garden pliers. Eddie has his head crushed with a belt around a tree. Anita has her throat slit. Demon gets a metal spike impaled through his back while he's in an outhouse. Junior is riding around on his dirt bike when a meat cleaver decapitates him. Ethel gets a cleaver to the head while making dinner. Jake ends up getting a cleaver to the face. Robin gets a machete impaled through her back while she's laying in a bunk bed. Violet gets grabbed and stabbed into the stomach with a machete while working on some dance moves. Duke the paramedic is found with his throat slit. Matthew is found with his throat slit and a metal spike impaled through his head. George is found with his eyes gouged out. And Ray, who's also imposter Jason, falls onto a tractor harrow and is impaled. Now, technically, if you do include the dream sequences, Pam also gets stabbed by Tommy in the end, as Tommy has snapped and is apparently becoming the new Jason. There was actual talks of going this direction with the next film, but that also fell through with the bad reception from this one. So, did you happen to know that there's more off screen deaths in this movie than any other Friday the 13th movie? Now, when it comes to my opinion on Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning, I do have to say, I did not like this one. It's not my least favorite, but it's definitely one of my least favorite in the Friday the 13th series. And that's mainly due to the fact that I did not like John Shepard as Tommy. I didn't like the storyline at all, and I especially did not like the fact that it wasn't Jason. I appreciate what they were trying to do and being different with this, but it did not work. So I'm going to give this one a 2 out of 5. Now, for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, what scene in this film was actually a cut scene from the last one, Friday the 13th, the final chapter? So the whole scene with Billy and Lana at the diner was originally created for the last film, the final chapter, but it didn't end up being used, so they wound up using it in this film. My guess is that it was going to be near the beginning of that last one, kind of when he was going to the grocery store. I think they either did that scene instead of this one, or it would have happened around the same time. And the biggest reason why I believe that's when it would have happened is the entire rest of the movie just happens at those two cabins. So I don't think there would have been other times to pass by that diner. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews. And if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.